On December 10, 1944, a test pilot named Gotthold Peter brought a new German jet fighter down over Schwechat airfield outside Vienna, 300 feet off the grass at close to 450 miles an hour, with senior Nazi officials watching from the ground. Partway through the pass, a section of his right wing tore away. The aircraft rolled, broke up, and went in. He never touched the ejection seat. However, what killed him was not the engine, and it was not really the design. It was the glue. To understand how the most technically advanced air force in the world ended up bonding fighter planes together with an adhesive that was quietly eating them from the inside, we need to go back 5 years to a grass airfield on the German Baltic coast. That airfield was Marienhahe, just outside Rostock. On the morning of August 27, 1939, a Luftwaffe test pilot named Erich Warsitz climbed into a small, stubby aircraft called the Heinkel He-178. It had a hole in the nose where a propeller should have been. 6 days before Germany invaded Poland, Warsitz took off, flew a circuit of the field, and landed. The flight lasted about 6 minutes, and it was the first time in history an aeroplane had flown on the thrust of a turbojet. Now, the engine was the work of a young physicist named Hans von Ohain, and Ernst Heinkel had funded the whole thing privately, without the Air Ministry ever asking for it. In later testing, the little jet was clocked at around 373 miles an hour. That was a shade quicker than an early Spitfire, from an aeroplane with no propeller at all. You might think that would have caused a stir in Berlin. On November 1, 1939, Heinkel demonstrated the aircraft for Ernst Udet and Erhard Milch, two of the most senior figures in German aviation. They watched it fly, they were polite, and then essentially nothing happened. The war was going to be won quickly with Messerschmitts and Junkers bombers, and a research aeroplane with 6 minutes of endurance did not fit that picture. Interestingly, the He-178 ended up in a Berlin museum, where it sat as a curiosity until an Allied bomb destroyed it in 1943. Heinkel kept going anyway. His company built a twin-engine jet fighter called the He-280, and in March of 1941, it flew under turbojet power, which made it the first jet fighter in the world to leave the ground. It had tricycle landing gear, twin tails, and one feature nobody else on Earth had bothered with: an ejection seat fired by compressed air. That seat is worth pausing on. On January 13, 1942, an He-280 was being towed aloft behind a pair of Messerschmitt 110s through a heavy snow shower when the control surfaces iced solid at around 7,800 feet. The pilot, Helmut Schenk, cast off the tow line, pulled the handle, and became the first human being ever to escape an aircraft using an ejection seat. The aeroplane was never found. Schenk walked away. So Germany had the world's first jet aircraft, the world's first jet fighter, and the world's first working ejection seat, all before the United States entered the war. And on March 27, 1943, Erhard Milch ordered the He-280 canceled. Some of that was technical, since the engines it needed never really arrived. Some of it was politics. Ernst Heinkel stayed bitter about it for the rest of his life. If aviation stories like this are your kind of thing, take a second and hit subscribe, because the next part is the part most people get wrong. The rush that killed Gotthold Peter over Vienna did not begin with panic. It began with a shortage of one metal. A jet engine is, in principle, a beautifully simple machine. You take air in at the front, squeeze it, set fire to it, and shove it out the back. The trouble is that the squeezing and the burning happen a few inches away from turbine blades spinning at around 9,000 revolutions a minute, inside what is effectively a furnace. Think of it like a kitchen extractor fan mounted inside your oven, running flat out at full temperature for hours at a time. Ordinary steel does not survive that. It softens and stretches under centrifugal load, a fraction of an inch at a time. And engineers call that creep. To stop it, you need alloys containing nickel, chromium, and cobalt, and by 1943 the Allied blockade meant Germany had almost none of those to spare. So Junkers did the only thing available. They redesigned the Jumo 004 turbojet around mild steel with a thin aluminium coating. It worked in the sense that the engine ran and the aircraft flew. It just wore out fast. Overhaul life was somewhere between 10 and 25 hours, and 25 hours is about a week of combat flying. Pilots learned to handle the throttle like a scalpel, because a quick shove forward could stall the compressor and set the engine on fire. That engine went into the Messerschmitt 262, which reached Luftwaffe squadrons in the autumn of 1944. The same season, the Royal Air Force put its Gloucester Meteors into 616 Squadron. On paper, the 262 was a nightmare for bomber crews, 100 miles an hour faster than a P-51 Mustang, and carrying 430mm cannon. Germany built around 1,400 of them. Only about 300 ever reached combat units. The rest sat at dispersed factories waiting for engines, or fuel, or somebody trained to fly them. Now, you have probably heard the story that Hitler personally ruined the 262 by insisting it be turned into a bomber. To be fair, that argument did happen, and it has been repeated in good faith for 80 years. But historians who have worked through the production records tend to land somewhere else. The 262 was already running roughly 2 years behind before Hitler ever weighed in, and the reason was the engines. Messerschmitt had airframes on the floor. What it lacked were turbines that would survive a combat sortie. By late summer 1944, the situation had stopped being difficult and started being arithmetic. Allied escort fighters had been turned loose over Germany, the Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than it could train replacements, and the bombing campaign against the oil industry had cut aviation fuel to a trickle. Two solutions were on the table. Adolf Galland, the general commanding the fighter arm, wanted everything poured into the Me-262. The other camp, which included Hermann Göring and Armaments Minister Albert Speer, argued that more 162s simply meant more expensive aeroplanes sitting broken on the ground. What Germany needed, they said, was a fighter cheap enough to throw away. On September 8, 1944, the Air Ministry issued the requirement. They called it the Volksjäger, the People's Fighter. Manufacturers had 10 days to submit a design. Mass production was to begin on January 1st. The aircraft had to weigh under 4,400 pounds, reach 470 miles an hour at sea level, and be built largely from wood by workers with no aviation training whatsoever. Galland thought the idea was madness. Willy Messerschmitt refused to bid at all. Heinkel, who happened to have a light jet fighter study already sitting in a drawer, won. Which brings us to the glue. Building an aeroplane out of wood is not primitive. The British did it brilliantly with the Mosquito. But a wooden aircraft is only ever as good as the bond holding the plywood together, and German wooden airframes had been designed around one specific adhesive called Tego film. It was not a liquid you brushed on. It was a sheet of paper saturated with phenolic resin that you laid between the layers and cured with heat, and it gave a clean, void-free bond every time. There was exactly one factory in Germany making it, a Goldschmidt plant at Wuppertal, and in 1943 the RAF flattened it. The replacement, produced by Dynamit AG, was roughly half as strong. It was also acidic. Over time, it did not merely fail to hold the wood together, it attacked the wood. And this is where the story stops being bad luck. The Germans already knew. Focke-Wulf had built a wooden night fighter called the Ta-154, and in July of 1944, one of them came apart in flight when the substitute adhesive ate through the wing structure. Production was halted in August. The program was canceled in September. The Volksjäger requirement went out on September 8, 1944. Same month, same glue. The first prototype, designated the Heinkel He-162, flew on December 6, 1944, from Schwechat, with Gotthold Peter at the controls. Depending on which date you count from, that is somewhere between 70 and 90 days from paper to airborne. Modern fighter programs measure that same gap in decades. The flight lasted about 20 minutes. During a high-speed run at around 520 miles an hour, the bond holding the nose gear door gave way, and the door departed the aircraft. Peter also reported that the aeroplane hunted in pitch and wandered in yaw. All of this was written down and filed. None of it changed the production schedule by a single day. 4 days later, he flew it again, low and fast, in front of officials who had come to see the miracle for themselves. This time, the adhesive let go in the wing itself. An aileron separated, the aircraft rolled, and it came apart in the air. He had an ejection seat underneath him and almost certainly could not reach the handle, pinned by the forces of an uncommanded roll a few hundred feet off the ground. The requirement that produced the airplane he was flying had been written 93 days earlier. You might expect a fatal breakup to stop the program, or at least slow it. It did not. The wing was strengthened, speeds were restricted to 310 miles an hour, and the second prototype flew on December 22nd. That one revealed a fresh problem. a wallowing side-to-side oscillation called Dutch roll, which on an airliner is uncomfortable and on a gun platform is disqualifying. There was no time for a proper redesign, so the engineers did what engineers always do when the calendar wins. They bolted lead ballast into the nose to drag the center of gravity forward, enlarged the tail surfaces, and hung small drooping aluminium tips on the wings, a fix credited to Alexander Lippisch. The airframe also proved too light to absorb the recoil of its own 30mm cannon, so the guns were downgraded to 20mm. And this was the aircraft the Air Ministry intended to hand to teenagers out of the Hitler Youth Glider program. It is worth being precise about who actually built these things, because the phrase in the specification was non-strategic materials and semi-skilled labor, which is a very tidy way of describing something that was not tidy at all. In practice, it meant the middlework tunnels near Nordhausen, an assembly line at Salzburg, and a worked-out gypsum mine at Hinterbrühl outside Vienna, codenamed Languste. The mine was pumped dry, floored with concrete, and staffed with roughly 1,800 prisoners from a subcamp of Mauthausen, working 12-hour shifts underground. They produced 198 fuselages. On April 1, 1945, with Soviet forces approaching, the camp was closed. 52 prisoners too weak to walk were shot before the column moved off. Of the 1884 who set out on foot for Mauthausen, 1624 arrived alive. The mine is a tourist attraction today, and there is a memorial a few streets away. Around 120 He-162s reached operational airfields. Close to 1,000 more were still on assembly lines when the war ended. The one unit that flew them in anger was the first group of Jagdgeschwader 1, which converted from Focke-Wulf 19s at Parchim in the spring of 1945. On April 6th, 134 B-17s bombed Parchim. The unit moved to Ludwigslust, then to Lech near the Danish border, and tried to master a temperamental jet fighter while its airfields were dismantled around it. The 162 carried about 30 minutes of fuel. In roughly 3 weeks of operations, the group lost 13 aircraft and 10 pilots, and only 2 of those aircraft were shot down. The rest were flameouts, structural failures, and at least 2 men killed trying to put a dead-stick jet into a field after running the tank dry. The ejection seat was fired in combat at least 4 times, and it did not save everyone. One pilot went out too low for his parachute to open, another died when the canopy failed to jettison ahead of the seat. On May 6, 1945, the survivors at Lech were handed to British troops, most of them having never flown. There is one more aircraft from these months worth knowing about, because it has since picked up a reputation it never quite earned. Reimar and Walter Horton were glidermen who had spent years chasing the Flying Wing, an aircraft with no fuselage and no tail, just wing. Less surface area means less drag means more range on the same fuel, and range mattered enormously with engines that drank the way the Jumo 004 did. Their design flew first as an unpowered glider in March of 1944. The powered version, the Ho 229 V2, flew on February 2, 1945, and by most accounts, handled well. On February 18, about 45 minutes into its third flight, one engine caught fire and stopped at around 2,600 feet. The pilot, Erwin Ziller, made a series of turns and shallow dives trying to restart it. He never used his radio, and he never left the aircraft, and there is a strong suspicion he was already unconscious from the fumes. The wing came down just beyond the airfield boundary, and Ziller died of his injuries. You have probably seen this airplane described as Hitler's stealth fighter. That story comes largely from Reimar Horton himself, writing years afterwards in Argentina, claiming he had mixed charcoal into the wood glue to absorb radar. In 2008, Northrop Grumman built a reproduction and tested it on a radar range for a television documentary, and the shape did cut detection range somewhat against a simulated wartime radar chain. But the curators at the Smithsonian, who own the only surviving airframe, are fairly blunt that stealth was not a design goal in 1944. It was an extremely clean glider with 2 jet engines buried in it, which is impressive enough without the mythology. So what do we take away from all of this? The men in these stories were not fools. Von Ohain built a working turbojet before anybody else on the planet. Heinkel's team put a functioning ejection seat into an aeroplane in 1941. The Horton brothers were decades ahead on airframe shape, and Northrop was still learning from that work in the 1980s. Give those teams nickel, time, and fuel, and several of these aircraft would have been formidable. What they did not have was time, and that is the part that carries across to every industry since. Compressing a schedule does not remove the work. It moves the cost of that work somewhere else, and it almost always lands on whoever happens to be sitting in the cockpit when the unfinished part finally lets go. The He-162 was not a bad aeroplane. Eric Brown, the Royal Navy test pilot who flew nearly 500 different types, thought it was superb in its element, and also said it was no aeroplane to let embryo pilots loose on. That is, the whole problem in a single sentence. Germany built a fighter that needed an expert precisely because it had run out of experts. If you want the other half of this story, the part where Allied engineers took these airframes apart at Farnborough and Wright Field and built the next 30 years of aviation out of what they found inside, that video is on screen now. Subscribe, and I will see you there.